The scream tore through the night before Elena Voss even reached the fence line. She dropped low, her boots sinking into wet grass, her heart slamming against her ribs. Something had already been here. She could smell it, sharp and wrong, cutting through the normal sense of pine and earth. Blood. Fresh blood, and underneath it, something else. Something that did not belong to any wolf she had ever tracked before. 3 sheep lay dead near the broken fence. But Elena barely looked at them. Her eyes were already moving, already reading the ground, the way other people read words on a page. A print here too light. A snapped branch there, too high for a normal wolf to reach. Whatever had done this had moved fast, and it had moved smart. She crouched beside the nearest print, and pressed 2 fingers into the mud beside it, measuring the depth against her own hand. Her breath caught. This was the 4th attack in 2 weeks, and every single time, the royal hunters had arrived too late, found too little, and returned to the palace with nothing but excuses. Elena was not a royal hunter. She held no title, no rank worth mentioning at court. She was an Omega, the lowest rung in Ashwood Kingdom's rigid pack structure, and most nobles did not know her name, even after she had lived among them for 6 years. But she knew this forest better than anyone alive, and she was not about to let fear stop her from finding out what was killing innocent animals under the king's own sky. She followed the trail for nearly a mile, before it vanished at a shallow stream, and she straightened slowly, wiping mud from her hands, staring into the dark tree line beyond the water. Whatever this was, it was clever enough to know how to disappear. By the time she made it back to the village at the edge of the palace grounds, dawn was breaking pink and gold over the mountains, and a small crowd had already gathered near the market square. She recognized the tension in their voices before she even understood the words. Another attack. Another failure. The kingdom was afraid, and fear had a way of turning into anger when it had nowhere else to go. At the center of the crowd stood Marcus Vane, the king's most decorated hunter, his silver armor gleaming despite the early hour, his expression carved from stone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of alpha that made lesser wolves lower their eyes without thinking. Elena had never lowered her eyes to anyone, and it had cost her more than once. "There is nothing more to report," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs. "The creature is fast. It does not stay in one place. We will find it." "You said that a week ago," someone called from the back of the crowd, and Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Elena pushed through the gathering, ignoring the way people stepped aside from her the moment they recognized her plain gray cloak, the mark of her low rank stitched into the collar. She had learned long ago not to expect warmth from these people. She had learned instead to let her work speak for her, even when no one wanted to listen. "I found something," she said, stopping a few feet from Marcus. "The tracks near the eastern pasture. They're not normal. The stride pattern changes every few hundred feet, like it's trying to confuse anyone following it." Marcus barely glanced at her. "This is not a matter for you to concern yourself with." "I'm not asking permission," Elena said. "I'm telling you what I saw." A ripple of surprise moved through the nearby villagers. Omegas did not speak to royal hunters that way, not in public, not ever. But Elena had spent too many sleepless nights walking those forests alone, learning every root and rise of the land, to stay silent while people she cared about lived in fear. Marcus finally looked at her properly, his eyes narrowing with something between irritation and reluctant curiosity. "You went out there alone, at night, after a killing. Someone had to. That was reckless." "That was necessary," Elena said, "since none of your hunters have managed to find a single useful trail in 2 weeks." The words landed harder than she intended, and for a moment she thought Marcus might actually respond with real anger. Instead, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of grudging respect quickly buried beneath his usual composure. "Bring your findings to the palace," he said finally. "Someone will review them." It was not the response Elena wanted, but it was something, and something was more than she usually received. She nodded once and turned to leave, already planning her route back into the forest, already thinking about the strange, doubled trail that had haunted her thoughts since the moment she found it. She did not know, as she walked away from the square that morning, that the creature she had tracked through the dark was about to change everything she believed about her place in this kingdom, about the king who ruled it, and about herself. The palace of Ashwood rose above the village, like something carved from the mountain itself, its towers catching the early light, its banners bearing the crest of the royal bloodline, a silver wolf howling beneath a crown of stars. Elena had walked past those gates 100 times without ever being invited through them. Today, for the first time, a guard actually stopped her and gestured her inside. "Alpha King Damian Cross is holding council," the guard said, his tone flat and unimpressed. "Marcus Vane said you have information about the attacks." Elena's pulse quickened, though she kept her face calm. She had heard stories about the king for years, about his cold efficiency, his refusal to tolerate weakness, his complete disinterest in anyone who could not prove their usefulness immediately. She had seen him from a distance a handful of times, always surrounded by advisors, always moving with the kind of purpose that made ordinary wolves step out of his path. She had never spoken to him. She had never expected to. The council hall was long and high-ceilinged, lined with tall windows that let in streams of morning light, illuminating the dust that hung in the air, like something suspended in time. A dozen advisors sat along a polished table, and at its head, in a chair that was less throne and more simple, imposing seat of authority, sat Damian Cross. He did not look up when she entered. He was studying a map spread across the table, his dark hair falling slightly across his forehead, his expression unreadable in the way of someone who had learned long ago never to show his thoughts before he was ready to share them. Even seated, there was something undeniably powerful about him, a stillness that felt more dangerous than movement. "This is the tracker," Marcus said, stepping forward. "The one I mentioned." Damian's eyes finally lifted, and Elena felt the full weight of his attention land on her like a physical thing. For half a second, something flickered across his face, curiosity perhaps, or simple assessment. Then it was gone, replaced by the same distant coolness he seemed to wear like armor. "You found tracks," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, my lord." Elena kept her voice steady, refusing to let the room's atmosphere shrink her the way it clearly wanted to. "The creature we're hunting isn't behaving like an ordinary rogue wolf. Its movements are deliberate. It changes its stride to confuse pursuit. It doubles back through water to break its scent trail. It waits until hunting parties have passed before it moves again." One of the advisors, an older wolf named Edmund Hale, made a small dismissive sound. "With respect, my king, this is the assessment of an Omega with no formal training. Our hunters have tracked rogues for generations." "And yet," Elena said before she could stop herself, "your hunters have found nothing in 2 weeks, while I found a trail within a single night." The room went very quiet. Elena felt the heat rise in her cheeks, aware that she had just spoken out of turn, in front of the most powerful wolf in the kingdom, but she did not look away. If she was going to be dismissed, she would at least be dismissed for telling the truth. Damian studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt it settle uncomfortably beneath her skin. Then he looked back down at his map, his tone clipped and final. "Marcus will continue leading the investigation. Your information has been noted." He did not look up again. "You may go." The words hit harder than she expected, though she should have known better than to hope for anything different. She had walked into that hall with real information, real evidence gathered at real risk to herself, and she was being sent away like a servant who had overstepped her welcome. She swallowed the sharp retort rising in her throat, because she knew exactly what would happen to an Omega who argued with a king in front of his council, and she was not willing to lose the freedom to keep searching for the truth on her own. "Yes, my lord," she said instead, and turned, and walked out of the hall with her spine straight and her jaw tight, refusing to let a single one of them see how much the dismissal had cost her. Outside, the morning air felt sharper than before, cold enough to clear her head. She stood at the top of the palace steps for a moment, looking out over the village and the dark line of forest beyond it, and made a decision that would change the course of her life. If the king would not use her skills, she would use them herself. She spent the rest of that day preparing. She sharpened her small blade, filled a satchel with dried meat and water, and pulled on her heaviest cloak against the evening chill. She told no one where she was going, because there was no one who would understand, and no one who would try very hard to stop her even if they did. By the time the sun sank behind the mountains, Elena was already back at the stream, where the trail had vanished, crouched low, studying the ground, with the kind of patience that came only from years of practice. The royal hunters searched with brute force and numbers, sweeping wide through the forest, expecting the rogue to reveal itself through carelessness. Elena searched differently. She searched the way a person reads a story, looking not just at what was there, but at what had been carefully hidden. She found it an hour before midnight, a single broken reed at the water's edge, bent in a direction that made no natural sense, unless something had crossed the stream and turned sharply north, away from the pasture and deeper into the old forest that bordered the palace lands. It was the kind of detail a less patient tracker would have walked past a dozen times. Her pulse quickened as she followed it, moving quietly through the trees, senses sharpened by the growing dark. The forest here was old and dense, the canopy blotting out most of the moonlight, forcing her to rely on scent and sound as much as sight. She heard nothing but the normal night sounds of the woods, and yet the hair on the back of her neck kept rising, some instinct warning her that she was not alone. She stopped near a cluster of boulders, crouching low, and that was when she smelled it again. The same strange, wrong scent from the pasture, closer now, close enough that her breath caught in her throat. Somewhere in the darkness ahead of her, something moved. Elena did not run. Running from something faster and stronger than herself would only guarantee disaster. Instead, she went still, every muscle locked, every sense straining toward the shifting shadows between the trees. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, through a gap in the brush, she caught a glimpse of eyes, pale and unnervingly intelligent, watching her from the darkness with an attention that felt almost human. It was watching her the same way she had been watching it. Her hand moved slowly toward the blade at her hip, though some instinct deeper than fear told her this was not the moment for violence. Whatever this creature was, it had evaded the kingdom's best hunters for weeks without being caught, and yet it had not attacked her, even now. Even with her standing close enough that a single leap could end everything. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said quietly, her voice barely more than breath. "I just want to understand." The eyes held hers for one more heartbeat. Then they vanished, and the forest went silent again, leaving Elena alone with her racing heart and the absolute certainty that everything she thought she knew about this rogue was wrong. She stayed crouched among the boulders until her legs ached, replaying the moment over and over, trying to make sense of what she had seen. It was not the movement of a mindless killer. There had been something deliberate in the way it watched her, something careful, almost cautious, as though it were the one afraid, rather than the other way around. By the time she made her way back toward the village, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, streaked with the first pale colors of morning. She was exhausted, her muscles sore from hours of careful, silent movement, but her mind refused to rest. Something about the creature's eyes stayed with her, a detail she could not shake no matter how many times she tried to explain it away. She did not know yet what she had found in those dark woods. She did not know that the true danger to Ashwood Kingdom was not the creature everyone feared, but something far closer to the throne itself. All she knew, as she finally reached her small home at the edge of the village and collapsed onto her bed without even removing her boots, was that she was not going to stop searching. Whatever secret hid in those trees, Elena Voss intended to find it, whether the Alpha King wanted her help or not. Elena woke to the sound of pounding at her door, sunlight slanting harsh through her narrow window, and for a moment, she could not remember why her body ached so badly. Then the memory returned all at once, the pale watching eyes, the strange stillness of the creature in the dark, and she sat up so fast her head spun. "I know you're in there," came a familiar voice through the door. It was Grace, her closest friend in the village, one of the few people who had never treated Elena's rank as a reason to keep her distance. "The whole village is talking about what happened at the council hall yesterday." Elena groaned and dragged herself to the door, opening it to find Grace standing with her arms crossed and an expression that was equal parts worry and amusement. "You told Edmund Hale off in front of the king," Grace said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "In front of the king, Elena. Do you have any idea what people are saying?" "I didn't tell him off. I disagreed with him." "You said his hunters found nothing, while you found something in one night, in front of the entire council." Grace shook her head, though there was a flicker of pride beneath her disbelief. "You're either the bravest wolf in this kingdom, or the most reckless." "Maybe both," Elena admitted, rubbing her eyes. Grace's gaze sharpened as she took in Elena's mud-streaked boots, still on her feet from the night before. "You went back out there. After everything." "I found it," Elena said quietly. "Or it found me." She told Grace everything: the broken reed at the water's edge, the strange trail deeper into the old forest, the eyes watching her from the shadows, with something that felt disturbingly close to intelligence. Grace listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with every detail. "That doesn't sound like an ordinary rogue," Grace said when Elena finished. "That sounds like something that used to belong to a pack. Something that knows how wolves think, how hunters move." "That's what I thought too," Elena said. "But if it used to belong to a pack, why is it living alone in the forest, killing livestock instead of hunting properly?" Grace had no answer for that, and neither did Elena, though the question settled into her thoughts and refused to leave. She spent the rest of the morning trying to rest, trying to eat something, trying to convince her racing mind to slow down long enough to think clearly. It was no use. By midday, she had already packed fresh supplies and was heading back toward the tree line, ignoring the ache in her legs and the quiet voice in her head, warning her that she was pushing her luck. The forest felt different in daylight, less menacing but no less mysterious, and Elena moved through it with the ease of someone who had spent half her life learning its secrets. She returned to the boulders where she had seen the creature the night before, searching the ground carefully for any trace it might have left behind. She found paw prints again, clearer this time in the softer earth near the base of the rocks, and her breath caught as she studied them closely. They were larger than a normal wolf's prints, but not by much, and the stride between them was even, controlled, nothing like the frantic pattern of a starving animal. This was not a creature acting purely on instinct. This was something thinking, planning, surviving, with deliberate care. She followed the trail for nearly 2 hours, deeper into territory she had never explored before, until the trees grew thick and ancient around her, their roots twisted like something out of an old story. The trail led to a shallow cave carved into the base of a rocky hillside, half hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines, and Elena stopped several yards away, her heart pounding. This was it. This was where the creature slept. She crouched low, studying the entrance for any sign of movement, weighing the risk of getting closer against the value of what she might learn. Every instinct told her to turn back, to report her findings, and let the royal hunters handle whatever waited inside that cave. But she had already tried reporting her findings, and she had already been dismissed once. She was not willing to walk away from real answers simply because approaching them was dangerous. She moved closer, one careful step at a time, her senses straining for any hint of danger. The scent grew stronger as she approached, that same strange, wrong smell from before. But underneath it now she caught something else. Blood, yes, but old blood, the smell of a wound that had been left too long without proper care. A low sound came from inside the cave, not quite a growl, more like a pained exhale, and Elena froze completely, every muscle locked with indecision. Whatever was in there was hurt, badly hurt, by the sound of it. "I know you're in there," she said softly, echoing the words Grace had spoken to her that morning, though her voice trembled slightly despite her best effort to keep it steady. "I'm not here to hurt you. I saw you last night, and you didn't attack me. I don't think you want to hurt anyone." Silence answered her, heavy and tense, and for a long moment, Elena wondered if she had imagined the sound entirely. Then she heard movement, slow and labored, and a shape emerged from the shadows of the cave entrance, low to the ground, favoring one side, its pale eyes fixed on her, with an expression that made her chest tighten with something unexpected. It was not fear she saw in those eyes. It was exhaustion. It was desperation. It was the look of a creature that had been running for so long, it had forgotten what safety felt like. Elena stayed perfectly still, letting the creature study her the way she had studied it, giving it every chance to decide for itself whether she was a threat. Slowly, carefully, it lowered itself back to the ground, no longer trying to hide, simply too exhausted to keep pretending it had the strength to run any further. That was when Elena saw the wound along its side, deep and inflamed, clearly days old, clearly the reason for its strange, careful movements through the forest. This was not a creature killing sheep out of malice or hunger for chaos. This was a creature barely surviving, stealing what it needed to live while running from something, or someone, that had already hurt it badly once. "Who did this to you?" Elena whispered, though she knew she would receive no answer, not from a wolf in this state, not from a stranger who had no reason to trust her. She spent the next hour simply sitting at a careful distance, speaking in a low, steady voice, letting the creature grow accustomed to her presence without trying to approach further. She had no medicine with her, nothing that could truly help with a wound like that, but she promised herself she would return, and soon, with supplies that might actually make a difference. As the light began to fade, she finally rose to leave, moving slowly, so as not to startle the wounded wolf. Its pale eyes followed her the entire time, and just before she stepped back into the deeper trees, she thought she saw something shift in its expression, something that almost looked like recognition, though she could not explain why the thought sent a chill down her spine. She walked back to the village with her mind spinning, turning the pieces over and over. A rogue with the wound of a fight it had clearly lost. A rogue, intelligent enough to evade the kingdom's best hunters for weeks. A rogue that had every opportunity to attack her, and chose, twice now, not to. None of it fit the story the palace had been telling. By the time she reached her home, she had made a decision. She could not simply report what she had found, not after being dismissed so completely the day before. If she brought this information to the council now, without proof, without a clearer understanding of what she was truly dealing with, she risked the royal hunters storming into that forest and killing an innocent, wounded creature before anyone bothered asking a single question. She would keep this secret a little longer. She would gather supplies, tend to the wound herself if the creature allowed it, and try to understand the truth before anyone else had the chance to destroy it. She did not sleep well that night, her mind replaying the desperate, exhausted look in those pale eyes. Somewhere in the back of her thoughts, a quieter worry had begun to take root as well, one she was not yet ready to examine too closely. The Alpha King had looked at her yesterday with something that was not quite dismissal, not entirely. There had been a flicker of something else in his gaze before he buried it beneath his usual coldness, something that made her wonder, despite everything, whether she had truly seen the last of Damien Cross's attention. She pushed the thought away, telling herself it did not matter, that a king who had dismissed her once would have no reason to think of her again. But as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, the memory of his dark, searching eyes lingered anyway, refusing to be forgotten quite as easily as she wanted it to be. The market square was louder than usual the next morning, voices overlapping in worry and speculation, and Elena kept her head down as she moved through the crowd, a basket of gathered herbs balanced against her hip. She had spent the early hours before dawn, searching for anything that might help clean and close a wound, calling on the small amount of healing knowledge her mother had taught her before she passed, knowledge Elena had never expected to need for a wolf that was not even part of her own pack. Another sheep gone missing, a merchant was saying to a small cluster of listeners near the well, this time from the northern farms. The king's hunters are saying the creature is growing bolder. Elena's stomach tightened. She knew exactly why the creature had grown bolder. It was starving, wounded, and desperate, stealing whatever it could reach because it no longer had the strength to hunt properly in the wild. The villagers saw a monster growing more dangerous. Elena saw a dying animal running out of options. She quickened her pace toward the forest, eager to check on the wolf and see whether it had survived the night, but she had barely reached the edge of the village when a familiar, unwelcome voice called her name. Elena Voss. She turned to find Marcus Vane standing near the training yard, his expression unreadable, his silver armor once again catching the morning light. Beside him stood two other hunters she recognized only by sight, both watching her with open curiosity. "I need to speak with you," Marcus said, and something in his tone made Elena's pulse quicken with unease. "About what?" "About the fact that you were seen leaving the eastern forest yesterday evening, well after the attacks have historically begun." He studied her carefully. "And about the fact that you have been seen leaving that same forest more than once this week." Elena kept her expression carefully neutral, though her mind raced. "I told your king I would search for information. I did not say I would stop. Even after being dismissed. Especially after being dismissed," Elena said, lifting her chin slightly. "Someone has to actually solve this problem, since apparently your hunters cannot." Marcus's jaw tightened, but there was no real anger in his eyes this time, only a strange, careful assessment, as though he were reconsidering something he had already decided about her. "You found something," he said, It was not a question. Elena hesitated. She did not trust Marcus completely, not after watching him stand silently beside Edmund Hale while she was dismissed from the council hall, but she also knew that continuing to hide everything indefinitely would eventually put both herself and the wounded wolf in greater danger. If the royal hunters found the cave on their own, without any context, without any understanding of what they were truly facing, the outcome would almost certainly be violent. "I found the creature," she admitted quietly. "It's wounded. Badly. I don't believe it's the mindless threat everyone assumes it is." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Wounded how?" "A deep injury along its side. Days old by the look of it. It's stealing food because it's too weak to hunt properly, not because it wants to cause chaos." "You approached it." "I did. And it didn't attack you." "No," Elena said. "It watched me. Both times. It could have attacked easily, and it chose not to." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his expression difficult to read. Finally, he glanced toward the palace, rising behind him, his voice dropping lower. "The king needs to hear this directly from you. Not filtered through a report, not summarized by Edmund Hale, directly. He wouldn't listen to me the first time. He will listen this time," Marcus said, and something in his voice made Elena believe him, though she could not have said exactly why. "Come with me." She followed him reluctantly toward the palace, her thoughts spinning with worry for the wolf she had left alone in that cave, wondering whether she was making a terrible mistake by trusting Marcus with even this much information. But she had already decided, somewhere deep down, that secrecy alone would not save that creature. If she wanted any chance of protecting it, she needed the king's understanding, not simply his ignorance. The council hall felt different this time, quieter, fewer advisors gathered around the long table, though Edmund Hale still sat near the head, watching Elena's arrival with open suspicion. Damien sat where he had before, his posture straight, his expression as guarded as ever, though something flickered across his face when his eyes landed on her, something Elena could not quite name. "She has new information," Marcus said, stepping forward. "Information I believe you need to hear directly, my king." Damien's gaze remained on Elena, steady and unreadable. "Go on." Elena took a breath, steadying her nerves, refusing to let the weight of the room shrink her voice the way it wanted to. "The creature attacking the livestock is wounded. Severely. I found its den 2 days ago, and I have approached it twice since then. It has not attacked me, though it had every opportunity to." A murmur moved through the few advisors present, and Edmund Hale leaned forward with visible skepticism. "You approached a dangerous rogue alone, twice, and it simply allowed you to walk away." "Yes. That is either remarkable luck," Edmund said coldly, "or a fabrication meant to draw attention away from your earlier insubordination." Elena's temper flared, but before she could respond, Damien spoke, his voice cutting through the tension with quiet authority. "Why would it spare her, if it has killed livestock without hesitation?" "I don't believe it wants to kill," Elena said, seizing the opening. "I believe it's desperate. Wounded animals often behave differently than healthy ones. It's not hunting for sport. It's stealing what it can reach, because it no longer has the strength to hunt the way it once could." "And you believe this because of what?" Edmund pressed. "Instinct." "Because of everything I've observed," Elena said firmly. "The stride pattern, the deliberate avoidance of your hunters, the fact that it has never approached the village itself despite clearly being desperate enough to. A creature acting purely out of malice would not show that kind of restraint." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her, with an intensity that made her chest tighten uncomfortably. Finally, he leaned forward slightly. "You said you found its den." "Yes." "Show me." The words hung in the air, unexpected enough that even Marcus looked faintly surprised. Edmund Hale opened his mouth to protest, but Damien did not wait for further discussion, rising from his seat with the kind of decisive movement that ended arguments before they truly began. "My king," Edmund began carefully, "surely it would be wiser to send hunters, rather than risk your own." "I am capable of assessing a threat myself," Damien said, his tone leaving no room for further debate. His eyes returned to Elena. "You will lead the way." Elena's heart pounded, torn between fear for the wounded creature and a strange, reluctant thrill at the idea of the Alpha King actually taking her seriously enough to follow her into the forest himself. She had spent 6 years being overlooked, dismissed, treated as though her skills meant nothing, simply because of the rank she had been born into. Now, suddenly, the most powerful wolf in the kingdom was asking her to guide him personally. "Yes, my king," she said, and turned to lead the way out of the hall, aware of his presence behind her the entire time, aware of the strange, careful energy radiating from him, despite his composed exterior. They left the palace with only Marcus accompanying them, Damien insisting on a small party rather than a large, intimidating force that might frighten the wounded creature into fleeing or attacking out of panic. Elena appreciated the decision more than she expected to, a small sign that perhaps the king was capable of more nuance than his reputation suggested. The walk through the forest was quiet, tense, filled with the kind of silence that felt heavier than words. Elena led them carefully, retracing the path she had memorized over the past 2 days, acutely aware of Damien's presence beside her, the way he moved through the trees with the same careful precision she recognized in herself, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, without ever missing a single detail. "You've been tracking this creature since before the council meeting," Damien said eventually, breaking the silence between them. "Yes, my king. Even after I dismissed you." Elena hesitated, unsure how honest to be, then decided she had already risked enough today that further honesty could hardly make things worse. "I couldn't stop simply because I was told to, not when I believed I was close to understanding the truth." Damien was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Most wolves in this kingdom would not have continued after such a clear dismissal. "Most wolves in this kingdom have never had to fight for every scrap of respect they've earned," Elena said, an edge creeping into her voice, despite her best effort to keep it controlled. "I've spent 6 years being told my rank determines my worth. I stopped believing that a long time ago." Something shifted in Damien's expression, something that looked almost like respect, though it vanished quickly beneath his usual composed mask. He said nothing more, but Elena noticed, for the rest of the walk, that his attention seemed to linger on her more often than strictly necessary, his dark eyes studying her with a curiosity he did not bother to fully hide. They reached the boulders as the afternoon light began to soften, and Elena raised a hand to signal quiet, gesturing toward the hidden cave entrance ahead. Damien's posture shifted immediately, alert and focused, though he held back at her signal, allowing her to approach first, as she had done twice before.
"I'm here again," Elena called softly toward the cave. "I brought help this time. Please don't be afraid."
For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then the same low, pained sound came from within the shadows, and slowly, cautiously, the wounded wolf emerged, its pale eyes immediately finding Elena's, before shifting warily toward Damien and Marcus standing several yards behind her. Damien went very still, his entire body tensing, and Elena glanced back to find an expression on his face she had not expected. Not simple caution, not the assessment of a king studying a threat, but something closer to shock, as though he recognized something in the wounded creature that no one else in their party could see. "That's not possible," Damien said quietly, almost to himself, his eyes never leaving the wolf. "My king?" Marcus asked, clearly noticing the same shift in his expression. Damien did not answer immediately, his gaze locked on the wounded creature, with an intensity that made Elena's chest tighten with sudden uncertainty. Whatever he was seeing, whatever he recognized in those pale, exhausted eyes, it was clearly something far more significant than a simple rogue wolf terrorizing the countryside. "My king," Elena said carefully, "do you know this wolf?" Damien's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply staring at the wounded creature with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something that looked painfully close to guilt. Finally he spoke, his voice low and unsteady, in a way Elena had never heard from him before. "I thought he was dead." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications Elena could not yet fully understand, and as the wounded wolf's pale eyes remained fixed on the king, with an expression that mirrored his own shock, Elena realized this discovery was about to unravel something far larger than a series of livestock attacks. Whatever history existed between Damien Cross and this wounded, hunted creature, it was clearly rooted in something the kingdom had never been told the truth about. And Elena, the overlooked Omega no one had ever bothered to truly see, had just stumbled into the very center of it. Marcus stepped forward instinctively, his hand moving toward the blade at his side, but Damien raised a hand without looking at him, a silent command that stopped the hunter in his tracks. The wounded wolf had not moved either, still crouched low near the cave entrance, watching the king with an expression that seemed to carry equal parts fear and something else, something that looked almost like desperate hope. "My king," Marcus said quietly, "if you know this creature, I think the kingdom deserves an explanation." Damien did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the wolf, his expression cycling through emotions Elena had never seen him display in public: shock, guilt, disbelief, and beneath all of it, something raw and unguarded that made her realize just how carefully he usually kept himself hidden from the world. "His name is Nolan," Damien said finally, his voice quiet. "He was one of my father's most trusted guards. He disappeared nearly a year ago, during the unrest after my father's death. We were told he had been killed defending the eastern border." Elena's breath caught. "Someone lied to you." "It would seem so," Damien said, his jaw tightening with barely restrained anger. He took a slow step forward, and the wounded wolf flinched but did not retreat. His pale eyes locked on Damien, with an intensity that spoke of recognition, of desperate relief, mixed with wariness he could not fully release. "Nolan," Damien said softly, "can you understand me?" The wolf's ears flattened slightly, and a low, broken sound escaped him, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, something caught painfully between the two. Elena watched, her chest tight, as understanding settled slowly over Damien's face. "He's been unable to shift back," Damien said quietly. "Something is preventing him." "That would explain the wound," Elena said, stepping closer despite the tension in the air. "A wound severe enough, or old enough, without proper care, could disrupt a wolf's ability to shift. If he's been stuck in this form for months, alone, running from hunters who believed him to be a mindless threat, then everything the kingdom believes about this creature has been wrong from the very beginning," Damien finished, his voice hardening with something that sounded distinctly like fury, though it was clear the anger was not directed at the wolf before them. Marcus lowered his hand slowly from his blade, his expression shifting from suspicion to something closer to horror as the pieces began falling into place. "If Nolan disappeared during the unrest after your father's passing, and someone told you he had died defending the border, then someone lied," Damien said again, quieter this time, "and I want to know why." Elena watched the king carefully, seeing past the composed exterior he wore like a second skin, catching glimpses of something far more complicated underneath. This was not simply a matter of a wounded wolf and a series of livestock attacks anymore. This was a mystery reaching directly into the palace itself, into the events surrounding the previous king's death, into whatever unrest had followed it. "We need to get him somewhere safe," Elena said, drawing everyone's attention back to the immediate problem. "His wound needs proper care, and quickly, or none of the rest of this will matter." Damien nodded, some of the raw emotion in his expression settling back beneath his usual composure, though Elena noticed it did not disappear entirely, not the way it usually did. "Marcus, prepare a secure route back to the palace. Somewhere private. No one is to know what we've found, until I understand exactly what happened to him." "Yes, my king." Damien turned back to the wounded wolf, crouching slowly to bring himself closer to eye level, his movements deliberate and careful. "I'm going to help you," he said quietly. "I promise you that. But I need you to trust me a little longer." Nolan's pale eyes shifted between Damien and Elena, something in his posture easing slightly, as though some deep, exhausted part of him finally believed rescue might actually be possible. He allowed Damien to approach, allowed Marcus to carefully help support his weight as they began the slow journey back toward the palace, and Elena walked alongside them the entire way, watching the king's face carefully, seeing the way his careful mask kept slipping to reveal something far more human underneath. The journey back was slow, careful, every step measured to avoid causing Nolan further pain. Elena found herself walking closer to Damien than she had expected, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating from him, the barely contained fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. "You truly believed he was dead," she said quietly, not quite a question. "I mourned him," Damien said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "He taught me to fight when I was young. He was loyal to my father in a way few others were, and loyal to me even after my father's death, when half the court seemed to be reconsidering their allegiances." His jaw tightened, If someone within my own council lied to me about his death, then covered up whatever truly happened to him, that person is not simply guilty of dishonesty. They are guilty of treason. You think this goes beyond a simple lie? I think, Damien said carefully, that someone wanted Nolan gone, and wanted me to believe he was dead so I would never look for him. And I think that same person likely knows exactly why he's been hiding in these woods for months, too wounded and too afraid to return to the one place that should have been safe for him. Elena absorbed this, her mind already turning over the implications. If someone within the palace had orchestrated Nolan's disappearance and subsequent exile into the wild, that same person had allowed the kingdom to spend weeks in fear, allowed the royal hunters to search for a dangerous rogue that did not actually exist, all to protect a secret significant enough to justify such an elaborate deception. Edmund Hale, she said quietly, the name leaving her lips before she had fully decided to say it aloud. Damien's eyes cut toward her sharply. What makes you say that? He was the first to dismiss my findings. Both times, Elena said carefully. He seemed almost eager to discredit anything that suggested the creature might not be the simple threat everyone assumed. That is not proof of anything, Damien said, though there was no real conviction in his tone, more the caution of someone unwilling to accuse a trusted advisor without solid evidence. No, Elena agreed, but it's worth watching him closely. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her, with an expression she could not quite read. You have a talent for seeing things others miss, he said finally. I dismissed you too quickly, the first time we spoke. Elena's chest tightened at the unexpected admission, warmth spreading through her despite everything else happening around them. You had no reason to trust an Omega you had never met before. I had every reason to trust competence, Damien said, his voice quiet but firm. I simply failed to recognize it when it was standing in front of me. The words settled somewhere deep in Elena's chest, and she found herself unable to look away from him, caught in the intensity of his dark eyes, even as they continued walking through the fading afternoon light. Whatever careful distance she had expected to maintain between herself and the Alpha King was already beginning to feel impossibly thin, and she was not entirely certain, as they made their way back toward the palace with a wounded, silent wolf between them, whether she wanted to rebuild that distance at all. They reached the palace as the sun began sinking fully behind the mountains, and Marcus guided them through a quiet side entrance, avoiding the main halls where curious eyes might catch sight of what they had brought home. Damien arranged for a healer he trusted absolutely, someone outside Edmund Hale's circle of influence, to tend to Nolan's wound in complete secrecy, and Elena stayed close throughout the process, offering what small knowledge she had, watching as the healer worked with careful, practiced hands. It was well into the night before Nolan finally settled into an exhausted, healing sleep, his wound cleaned and properly bandaged for the first time, in what had clearly been far too long. Damien stood at the edge of the small, secure room they had prepared for him, his expression heavy with a mixture of relief and simmering anger, and Elena found herself standing quietly beside him, unwilling to leave despite the lateness of the hour. Thank you, Damien said eventually, his voice low. If you hadn't kept searching, if you hadn't refused to simply accept my dismissal, we might never have found him in time. I couldn't have done it without your help getting him back here safely, Elena said. And your healer's skill. Perhaps, Damien said, but none of it would have mattered without you finding him first. He turned to look at her fully, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I owe you an apology, Elena Voss. A proper one. I judged you unfairly, and it very nearly cost a good man his life. Elena did not know what to say, standing there in the quiet, dim room with the most powerful wolf in the kingdom, looking at her as though she were the only person in the world worth his full attention. 6 years of being overlooked, dismissed, treated as though her worth began and ended with her rank, and now the Alpha King himself stood before her, offering an apology she had never expected to receive. Apology accepted, she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. Something shifted in Damien's expression, something warm and unguarded breaking through the careful composure he had worn since the moment she met him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with something new and unfamiliar, something Elena was not entirely sure either of them was ready to name. But whatever this new understanding between them meant, Elena knew one thing, with absolute certainty, as she finally left the palace that night, walking back toward her small home beneath a sky full of quiet stars. This was no longer simply about finding a dangerous rogue. This was about uncovering a conspiracy hidden deep within the palace walls, a conspiracy that had already cost one loyal wolf nearly everything, and Elena intended to see it exposed, whatever the cost. News of the rogue's disappearance spread through the village within 2 days, though no one knew the true reason behind it. Rumors filled the gap left by silence, some claiming the creature had finally been killed by the royal hunters, others whispering that it had simply moved on to terrorize some other unfortunate corner of the kingdom. Elena said nothing to correct any of it, keeping her promise to Damien to protect Nolan's secret until they understood exactly who had betrayed him and why. She found herself at the palace more often now, summoned quietly through Marcus rather than any formal invitation, always slipping in through the same side entrance they had used the night they brought Nolan home. Each visit followed the same pattern. She would check on Nolan's healing progress, exchange careful updates with Damien about anything unusual she had noticed in the village or the forest, and then linger longer than either of them probably should have allowed, caught in conversations that stretched far beyond the practical matters that had originally brought them together. "He's stronger today," the healer told them on the 4th morning, checking the wound along Nolan's side with careful, experienced hands. "The infection has finally cleared. Given a few more days of rest, I believe he'll be strong enough to attempt shifting back to his true form." Relief passed visibly across Damien's face, and Elena felt an answering warmth in her own chest, watching the way genuine care softened the king's usually guarded expression. Nolan, resting on a thick pile of blankets in the corner of the room, lifted his head at the healer's words, his pale eyes finding Damien's with something that looked almost like hope. "That's good news," Damien said, crouching beside him. "You'll be able to tell us everything soon." Nolan made a low sound of agreement, though exhaustion still weighed heavily in his posture, and Damien rested a hand gently against the wolf's head, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that Elena had to look away, feeling as though she were intruding on something deeply private. "You care for him a great deal," she said quietly, once they had stepped out of the room, leaving Nolan to rest. "He saved my life once," Damien admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I was young, still learning what it meant to be an alpha's son, careless, in ways that nearly got me killed during a border skirmish. Nolan pulled me out of danger without hesitation, took a wound meant for me in the process." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I owe him more than I could ever repay, and instead, I let someone convince the entire kingdom he was dead, without questioning it properly." "You had no reason to suspect deception," Elena said gently. "Grief makes people accept explanations they might otherwise question." "Perhaps," Damien said, though the guilt in his voice remained clear. "But I am the Alpha King. I cannot afford the luxury of simple grief, when it comes at the cost of overlooking betrayal within my own walls." They walked together through a quiet garden courtyard, the kind of space Elena had never imagined she would ever have reason to visit, surrounded by carefully tended flowers and the soft sound of a fountain somewhere nearby. It felt strange, being here with him. Strange in a way that had nothing to do with the danger surrounding them, and everything to do with how comfortable the silence between them had become. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said eventually, breaking the quiet. "Of course. Why did you dismiss me so completely, that first day, before you had any reason to trust or distrust my abilities?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with obvious care. "Because I have spent my entire reign surrounded by wolves who tell me what they think I want to hear," he said finally. "Advisors who agree simply because agreement is safer than honesty. When you stood in that hall and challenged Edmund Hale directly, I assumed it was arrogance, an Omega overstepping her place to seek attention." He glanced at her, something apologetic in his expression. "It took me longer than it should have to recognize the difference between arrogance and simple, unflinching honesty. I've never been very good at staying quiet when I believe I'm right," Elena admitted. "It's gotten me into trouble more than once." "I imagine it has," Damien said, and something like amusement flickered across his features, softening the tension that usually lived there. "For what it's worth, I find I prefer it to the alternative." Elena felt warmth rise in her cheeks, and she looked away toward the fountain, uncertain how to respond to the quiet sincerity in his voice. This was not the cold, dismissive king she had expected to encounter the first time she walked into his council hall. This was someone far more complicated, someone carrying the weight of his position, with a seriousness that occasionally cracked to reveal genuine warmth underneath. "I should return to the village before I'm missed," she said eventually, though some part of her was reluctant to leave. "Elena," Damien's voice stopped her before she had taken more than a few steps, and she turned back to find him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Thank you for everything you've done. I don't think I've said that clearly enough." "You don't need to keep thanking me, my king." "Damien," he said quietly, "when it's just the two of us, I would prefer you use my name." The request settled somewhere warm and unfamiliar in her chest, and she nodded, unable to fully trust her voice in that moment. "Damien," she repeated softly, testing the shape of it, and something shifted in his expression at the sound of his own name, spoken so gently, something that looked dangerously close to the beginning of feelings neither of them had any business entertaining, given the vast difference in their positions. She left the palace that evening with her thoughts full of him, of the careful warmth in his eyes, of the quiet vulnerability he had allowed her to see. It frightened her, how quickly the distance between them seemed to be dissolving, how easily she found herself thinking of him throughout her days now, wondering what he was doing, whether he was thinking of her in return. She told herself it did not matter, that whatever strange connection was forming between them could not survive the reality of their vastly different positions in the kingdom. Alpha kings did not choose omegas as anything more than passing curiosities, and Elena had spent too many years building her own quiet strength to risk it all on feelings that would likely lead nowhere but heartbreak. But as the days passed, as her visits to the palace continued, as Nolan's strength slowly returned, and Damien's guarded walls continued to soften in her presence, Elena found it increasingly difficult to convince herself that nothing was changing between them. Something was changing. She could feel it in every careful glance, every moment of comfortable silence, every time his dark eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. And despite every reasonable argument she made to herself about the impossibility of it all, some quiet, stubborn part of her had already stopped wanting to fight it. 5 days after they brought Nolan home, the healer finally declared him strong enough to attempt a full shift, and Elena found herself standing beside Damien in the small, secure room, waiting with held breath as Nolan closed his pale eyes and concentrated, his body trembling with effort after so many months trapped in his wolf form. The shift, when it finally came, was slow and clearly painful, but complete. Where the wounded wolf had rested moments before, a man now knelt on the floor, breathing hard, his dark hair damp with sweat, his side still marked with the fading scar of his injury. He looked up at Damien with exhausted, grateful eyes, and the king crossed the room immediately, pulling him into a fierce, relieved embrace. "I thought I'd lost you," Damien said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "I thought so too. More than once," Nolan admitted, his voice hoarse from months of silence. He pulled back slightly, his gaze shifting to Elena with obvious curiosity. "Who is this?" "This is Elena Voss," Damien said, and something in the way he said her name made warmth spread through her chest. "The tracker who found you when no one else could." Nolan studied her for a long moment, something like understanding passing across his features. "Then I owe you my life," he said quietly. "Twice, it seems, since you also convinced your king not to send hunters to kill me on sight." "You're welcome," Elena said, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of the moment. "Though I imagine you have quite a story to tell about who put you in that position in the first place." Nolan's expression darkened, the exhaustion in his eyes giving way to something colder, angrier. "I do," he said, "and I don't think either of you are going to like what I have to tell you." Damien's jaw tightened, his hand still resting protectively on Nolan's shoulder. "Whatever it is, we need to hear it. All of it." Nolan glanced between them, drawing a slow, steadying breath, and Elena felt the weight of the moment settle heavily over the small room. Whatever truth he was about to reveal, she sensed it would confirm every suspicion she had begun to form, and likely reveal a betrayal far deeper and more dangerous than any of them had yet imagined. "It started the night your father died," Nolan began quietly, and Elena leaned forward, bracing herself for whatever came next. "I was on duty outside your father's chambers that night," Nolan said, his voice steady, despite the obvious weight of the memory. There had been whispers for weeks that his health was failing faster than the healers admitted publicly, and Edmund Hale had been visiting him more often than usual, always late in the evening, always insisting on privacy. Damien's expression hardened, though he said nothing, allowing Nolan to continue at his own pace. The night he died, I heard raised voices before the silence, Nolan continued. Your father's voice, weak but angry, and Edmund's, calm in a way that felt wrong given the circumstances. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard enough. Something about a decision your father had made regarding the succession, something Edmund clearly disagreed with. My father never mentioned any dispute over succession, Damien said quietly. I don't believe he had the chance to tell you, Nolan said. By morning he was gone, and the healers declared his death a natural consequence of his declining health. I might have believed it myself, if I hadn't heard that argument the night before. He paused, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. I made the mistake of mentioning what I'd heard to one of the other guards, someone I trusted. Within 2 days, I was ambushed on a routine patrol along the eastern border, wounded badly enough that I couldn't defend myself properly. Edmund, Elena said quietly, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. I never saw who attacked me clearly enough to be certain, Nolan admitted, but I know it was no ordinary bandit. Whoever it was knew my patrol route, knew exactly when I would be most vulnerable. I managed to escape, but barely, and I understood immediately that returning to the palace would mean walking straight back into danger from someone with enough influence to make my death look like an unfortunate accident, exactly the way your father's had been made to look. So you ran, Damien said quietly. I had no other choice, Nolan said, his voice tightening with old pain. I couldn't shift back properly with the wound as severe as it was, and even if I could have, I had no way of knowing who else within the palace might be involved. I didn't know who to trust, so I trusted no one. I survived in the forest as best I could, hoping the wound would heal enough eventually that I could find a way to expose the truth safely. Instead, you nearly died out there alone, Elena said softly, hunted by the very people who should have been protecting the kingdom from whoever actually killed the previous king. Nolan nodded grimly. I never intended to hurt anyone. I took what I needed to survive because I had no other option, but every attack made the situation worse, made me look exactly like the dangerous threat everyone assumed I was. I couldn't risk approaching anyone directly, not without proof, not without understanding exactly how far Edmund's influence within the palace truly extended. Damien was silent for a long moment, his expression carefully controlled despite the obvious storm of emotion beneath it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerously calm. If Edmund orchestrated my father's death, and then arranged your near assassination to keep the truth buried, then he has spent the past year sitting at my council table, offering advice, shaping decisions, all while carrying the blood of my father on his hands. We have no direct proof, Elena said carefully, though her own anger burned just as fiercely beneath her measured tone. Only Nolan's account of an overheard argument and an ambush he couldn't fully identify. That may be true, Damien said, but it's enough to warrant a proper investigation. Quiet, careful, and thorough enough that Edmund has no opportunity to cover his tracks further before we're ready to act. What do you need from me? Elena asked. Damien's dark eyes met hers, something fierce and determined burning in their depths. The same thing I needed from the beginning, though I was too foolish to recognize it at first. Your instincts, your ability to see what others overlook. He paused, his voice softening slightly. I want you working directly with me on this, Elena. Not as an afterthought, not as someone I consult only when convenient, as an equal partner in uncovering the truth. The offer settled heavily in Elena's chest, equal parts thrilling and terrifying. 6 years of being dismissed, overlooked, treated as though her worth ended at her rank, and now the Alpha King himself was asking her to stand beside him as an equal in exposing a conspiracy that reached to the very heart of his kingdom. I accept, she said, without hesitation, and something in Damien's expression eased slightly at her answer, warmth breaking through the tension that had gripped his features throughout Nolan's account. They spent the following days working carefully, quietly, gathering whatever evidence they could without alerting Edmund to their suspicions. Elena used her tracking skills in new ways now, following the movements of Edmund's known associates, noting unusual meetings, unexplained absences, careful patterns that suggested a wolf accustomed to operating in the shadows. Marcus, once he learned the full truth, proved an invaluable ally as well, using his position among the royal hunters to quietly investigate the details surrounding the ambush that had nearly killed Nolan a year earlier. Slowly, piece by piece, a clearer picture began to emerge. Edmund had, in the months before the previous king's death, been quietly meeting with several merchant families who stood to profit enormously from trade agreements the old king had firmly opposed. Documents Marcus managed to uncover, carefully and without drawing attention, suggested Edmund stood to gain significant wealth and influence, should those agreements finally move forward, under a more easily persuaded ruler. He wanted a king he could control, Damien said grimly, studying the documents spread across a private table in his personal chambers, well away from the council hall where Edmund might overhear anything. My father refused to be manipulated. Perhaps he believed I would be different. He miscalculated, Elena said quietly. Clearly, Damien agreed, though the weight of the past year's grief remained heavy in his voice. But he came dangerously close to succeeding. If Nolan hadn't survived, if you hadn't found him when you did, I might never have uncovered any of this. Elena reached out instinctively, resting her hand over his where it rested against the table, and Damien went still at the contact, his dark eyes lifting to meet hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Neither of them moved away. We're going to expose him, Elena said softly, and your father's memory will finally receive the justice it deserves. Our father's memory, Damien corrected quietly, and Nolan's stolen year, and every wolf in this kingdom, who has lived in fear of a threat that was never truly what everyone believed it to be. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither had fully acknowledged aloud, though Elena felt it in every careful breath, every lingering glance. Whatever was growing between them, it had become far too significant to dismiss as simple gratitude or professional respect. She was falling for the Alpha King, impossibly, dangerously, and the way his hand turned beneath hers, fingers lacing gently through her own, told her the feeling was far from one-sided. Elena, Damien said quietly, his voice rough with something he seemed to be fighting to contain. When this is finished, when Edmund has answered for what he's done, I want to speak with you properly, about what's happening between us. I would like that, Elena admitted, warmth spreading through her chest despite the seriousness of everything surrounding them. Damien's expression softened, something achingly tender passing across his usually guarded features, and for a brief, quiet moment, the weight of conspiracy and betrayal faded into the background, leaving only the two of them, hands joined together, hearts caught in the early fragile stages of something neither had expected to find. But the moment could not last. A sharp knock at the door pulled them both back to reality, and Marcus's urgent voice carried through the wood before either of them could respond. "My king," he called, his tone unmistakably tense. "You need to come immediately. Edmund knows we've been investigating him. He's already gone." Damien was on his feet immediately, all traces of the tender moment between them replaced by the sharp, focused authority of a king, facing an urgent threat. "Gone where?" Marcus stood in the doorway, breathing hard, clearly having run through the palace corridors to deliver the news. One of the stable hands saw him leave, through the western gate, less than an hour ago, alone, moving fast. He took one of the fastest horses in the royal stables. "How did he know we were investigating him?" Elena asked, her mind already racing through the past few days, searching for any mistake that might have alerted Edmund to their suspicions. "I don't know," Marcus admitted grimly, "but it hardly matters now. If he's fleeing, it's as good as a confession. Or he's going somewhere to cover his tracks further," Damien said, already moving toward the door, his expression hardening into something cold and determined. "Either way, we cannot allow him to escape justice, not after everything he's taken from this kingdom." Nolan appeared in the doorway behind Marcus, still moving carefully due to his healing wound, but his expression was fierce, despite his physical limitations. "I want to be part of this." "You're not fully healed," Damien said firmly. "I've spent a year hiding in the woods because of what that man did," Nolan said, his voice hard. "I intend to see this through to the end." Damien hesitated only a moment before nodding, understanding the need burning in his old friend's eyes. "Stay close to Marcus. Don't take unnecessary risks. Elena stepped forward as well, her own resolve firm despite the danger clearly ahead. I'm coming too. I know these lands better than anyone, and if Edmund is trying to disappear into the forest, my tracking skills will be more valuable now than ever. Damien's eyes met hers, worry flickering briefly beneath his determination, but he did not argue. Stay close to me, he said instead, and Elena nodded, understanding the request for exactly what it was, not simply strategic caution, but genuine concern he could not fully hide, even in the urgency of the moment. They gathered quickly, a small, focused party, moving out through the western gate within minutes, following the fresh trail left by Edmund's hurried departure. Elena took the lead almost immediately, her sharp eyes catching details the others might have missed: broken grass, disturbed earth, the faint but unmistakable scent trail leading away from the palace and toward the older, denser forest bordering the kingdom's western edge. He's heading toward the old smuggler's paths, Elena said, studying the direction of the trail carefully. There are tunnels through the mountains out that way, old and mostly forgotten, but still passable if someone knew where to look. How would Edmund know about smuggler's paths? Marcus asked, frowning. The same way he knew how to arrange an assassination attempt disguised as an ordinary ambush, Damien said grimly. He has connections we clearly underestimated. They pushed hard through the forest, the afternoon light beginning to fade as they moved deeper into unfamiliar terrain, and Elena's focus never wavered, her tracking instincts guiding them steadily along Edmund's trail, despite his obvious attempts to obscure it. The chase carried a tension unlike anything Elena had experienced in her years of tracking. Every sense heightened, every careful decision carrying weight far beyond simple survival. They found him just as the sun began sinking fully behind the mountains, at the mouth of a narrow rocky pass that Elena recognized immediately as one of the old smuggler's routes she had heard about in stories but never personally explored. Edmund stood near a waiting horse, clearly preparing to disappear into the mountain paths, where pursuit would become significantly more difficult, but he turned sharply at the sound of their approach, his expression shifting from surprise to cold, calculated resignation. I wondered how long it would take, Edmund said, his voice steady, despite the situation, though Elena noticed the tension in his shoulders, the careful way his eyes assessed their numbers and positioning. You always were sharper than your father gave you credit for, my king. I underestimated how quickly you would piece things together. You murdered my father, Damien said, his voice low and dangerous, every trace of warmth gone from his expression, replaced by something fierce and unforgiving. And when Nolan discovered the truth, you tried to have him killed as well. Your father was going to ruin this kingdom's prosperity, out of stubborn, outdated principle, Edmund said, no hint of remorse in his voice. The trade agreements he refused would have secured wealth and stability for generations. I simply hastened along what his failing health would have accomplished within months regardless. You don't get to decide that, Elena said sharply, unable to keep silent in the face of such casual justification for murder. You don't get to decide whose life matters less because it's inconvenient to your ambitions. Edmund's eyes shifted toward her, something cold and dismissive in his gaze despite the danger of his situation. The Omega Tracker, he said, almost mockingly. I should have realized sooner that you would become a problem. You have a talent for noticing things that were meant to remain hidden. That talent is exactly what's about to end your freedom, Marcus said, stepping forward with his hand resting firmly on his weapon. Edmund's gaze swept across the group, calculating, searching for any advantage, and Elena watched the exact moment his expression shifted from resigned calm to something far more dangerous, the desperate calculation of a wolf realizing he had no clean escape remaining. I won't return to face judgment for crimes I don't believe were crimes at all, Edmund said quietly, and before anyone could react, he moved, not toward the waiting horse, but directly toward Damien, a hidden blade appearing in his hand with practiced speed. Elena's heart lurched, every instinct screaming a warning, and without fully thinking through the danger, she moved, throwing herself between Edmund's advancing blade and the king she had, despite every reasonable argument against it, come to care for deeply. She felt the sharp, burning pain along her arm as the blade caught her instead of its intended target, but the moment of distraction was enough for Marcus and Nolan to close the distance, wrestling Edmund to the ground before he could attempt a second strike. Elena, Damien's voice was sharp with panic, his hands immediately finding the wound along her arm, pressing firmly to slow the bleeding, his composed authority completely shattered in the face of her injury. "Why would you do that?" "Because I wasn't about to let him hurt you," Elena said through gritted teeth, pain radiating through her arm, but her voice steady despite it. "Not when we've come this far." Damien's expression cracked with an emotion so raw and unguarded that Elena forgot the pain entirely for a moment, caught in the intensity of his gaze. "You could have been killed. But I wasn't," she said softly. "And neither were you." Behind them, Marcus and Nolan had Edmund fully restrained, the disgraced advisor's expression twisted with fury and humiliation at his failed escape. Damien tore his gaze away from Elena reluctantly, his voice hardening once more, as he addressed the wolf responsible for so much suffering. "Edmund Hale," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, despite the tension still radiating through his body. "You are under arrest for the murder of King Aldrich Cross, the attempted murder of Nolan, and the attempted murder of myself and Elena Voss. You will be returned to the palace, to face judgment for your crimes." Edmund said nothing further, his expression settling into cold, defeated silence, as Marcus and Nolan secured him properly for the journey back. Damien turned his full attention back to Elena, his hands still careful and gentle against her wounded arm, his eyes searching hers with a tenderness that made the pain fade into something almost bearable. "Let's get you properly tended to," he said softly. "And then, Elena Voss, we are going to have that conversation I promised you." Despite the ache in her arm and the exhaustion settling heavily over her body, Elena felt a warm, hopeful smile tug at her lips. "I'm looking forward to it," she said quietly, and the answering warmth in Damien's dark eyes told her, without any need for further words, that whatever conversation lay ahead of them would finally give voice to everything they had both been too cautious to say aloud, until now. The journey back to the palace felt entirely different from the tense march that had carried them toward the smuggler's pass only hours earlier. Edmund rode in silence, bound securely, and flanked closely by Marcus and Nolan, his earlier confidence replaced by a hollow, defeated stillness that seemed to age him years in the span of a single afternoon. Elena rode beside Damien, her wounded arm bandaged tightly with strips torn from his own cloak, the pain dulled now to a steady throb she barely noticed beneath the exhausted satisfaction of finally seeing justice within reach. "You should rest that arm properly once we're back," Damien said, glancing at her with the same careful concern he had not fully released since the moment the blade found her instead of him. "I will," Elena promised, though her attention drifted more toward the quiet warmth in his voice than the practical concern of her injury. "You still owe me a conversation, remember?" A faint, tired smile touched Damien's lips, the first genuine lightness she had seen from him since Marcus's urgent announcement had interrupted their earlier moment together. "I remember," he said softly. "I haven't forgotten a single word." They reached the palace as the last light faded fully from the sky, torches already lit along the walls, and word of Edmund's capture spread quickly through the halls, even before they had fully dismounted. Guards moved to secure the disgraced advisor properly, and Damien issued quiet, efficient instructions for a formal trial to begin the following morning, his authority firm and unwavering despite the emotional weight of the day's events. Once Edmund had been taken away and Nolan settled properly to rest, once Elena's arm had been cleaned and stitched by the same trusted healer who had cared for Nolan's wounds, Damien found her again, in the quiet garden courtyard, where they had spoken so openly just days before. The fountain still murmured softly in the darkness, and the flowers around them had closed for the night, leaving only their gentle fragrance lingering in the cool evening air. "How is your arm?" Damien asked, settling beside her on the stone bench. "It will heal," Elena said. "The healer says I was fortunate the blade didn't cut deeper." "You shouldn't have taken that risk," Damien said quietly, though there was no real reproach in his voice, only lingering worry he could not fully set aside. "I don't know what I would have done if you had been more seriously hurt." "I couldn't stand there and watch him hurt you," Elena said simply. Whatever risk that carried, it was worth it. Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the soft light of the nearby torches, and Elena felt her heart quicken beneath his careful attention, uncertain what he was thinking, hopeful despite herself for what he might say next. "I have spent my entire reign believing that caring deeply for someone was a weakness I could not afford, Damien said finally, his voice low and honest, in a way she had never heard from him before. My father taught me that an alpha king must remain guarded, controlled, never allowing personal feelings to interfere with the responsibilities of leadership. I believed that completely, until you walked into my council hall and refused to accept my dismissal. Elena's breath caught, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief as she listened. You have challenged every assumption I held about strength, about worth, about what truly matters in this kingdom, Damien continued. You found Nolan when my entire force of royal hunters failed. You uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of my council, and today, you placed yourself between me and a blade without a single moment's hesitation. He reached out, gently taking her uninjured hand in his own, his dark eyes holding hers with unguarded sincerity. I don't want to hide what I feel for you any longer, Elena. Not behind rank, not behind duty, not behind fear of what others might say. I care for you deeply, and I have from the moment I finally allowed myself to truly see you. Tears gathered unexpectedly in Elena's eyes, warmth spreading through her entire body at the sincerity in his voice, at the vulnerability he had allowed her to see so completely. I never expected this, she admitted softly. Not from you, not from anyone, if I'm honest. I stopped believing a long time ago that someone in your position could ever truly see someone like me. Then let me correct that belief properly, Damien said, lifting her hand gently to press a soft kiss against her knuckles. I see you, Elena Voss. I see your courage, your intelligence, your refusal to accept anything less than the truth. I see a woman who deserves far more recognition than this kingdom has ever given her, and I intend to make certain that changes, starting now. Damien, Elena whispered, his name carrying every ounce of emotion she had been carefully guarding since the moment she first met his dark, searching eyes in that crowded council hall. He leaned closer, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and when she did not, when instead she leaned toward him just as eagerly, their lips finally met in a kiss that felt like the culmination of everything building quietly between them since that very first meeting. It was soft and careful at first, mindful of her injury, mindful of the emotional weight of the day, but it deepened slowly into something warm and certain, sealing a promise neither of them had dared to voice aloud until now. When they finally parted, Damien rested his forehead gently against hers, his breath still slightly unsteady. I don't care what tradition says about who an alpha king should choose, he said softly. I choose you, Elena. Rank has never determined your worth, not truly, and I refuse to let it determine your place in my life any longer. Elena smiled through her tears, warmth and hope filling every part of her chest. Then I choose you too, she said simply. Difficult, stubborn, and entirely too composed for your own good. Damien laughed softly, a genuine, unguarded sound she had never heard from him before, and the warmth of it settled deep into her heart, promising a future neither of them could have imagined just weeks earlier, when she was nothing more than an overlooked tracker, and he was nothing more than a distant, dismissive king. Edmund's trial began the next morning, in the same council hall where Elena had first been dismissed, though the atmosphere within those walls felt entirely different now. Word of the disgraced advisor's crimes had spread quickly through the palace and into the village beyond, and the hall was filled far beyond its usual capacity, wolves from every rank, gathering to witness justice finally being served, for a betrayal that had shaken the very foundation of the kingdom's trust. Elena stood near the front of the gathered crowd, her wounded arm still carefully bandaged beneath her sleeve, watching as Damien presided over the proceedings with a calm, unwavering authority that commanded the respect of everyone present. Nolan testified first, recounting the overheard argument the night of the previous king's death, followed by Marcus, who presented the documents uncovered during their careful investigation, evidence of Edmund's secret dealings with merchant families, eager to profit from trade agreements the old king had firmly opposed. Edmund offered no real defense, his earlier calculated composure entirely gone, replaced by the hollow resignation of a wolf who understood there was no escaping the consequences of his actions any longer. When Damien finally delivered his judgment, exile to the furthest, harshest reaches of the kingdom's borders, stripped of all rank and privilege, the hall erupted into a mixture of relief and quiet, satisfied murmurs. As the crowd began to disperse, Damien rose from his seat, and did something that made the entire remaining assembly fall into stunned silence. He walked directly toward Elena, extending his hand toward her in full view of the gathered court. "This kingdom owes Elena Voss a debt it can never fully repay," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. Her skill, her courage, and her refusal to accept injustice uncovered a betrayal that had gone unnoticed by every advisor, every hunter, and every wolf sworn to protect this kingdom's truth. "From this day forward, she will serve as my personal advisor on matters of investigation and tracking, with full rank and recognition befitting her contributions." Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers of surprise and admiration replacing the earlier tension of the trial, and Elena felt her cheeks warm under the sudden weight of so many eyes turned toward her. She stepped forward and took Damien's offered hand, feeling the steady warmth of his grip, the quiet pride evident in his expression as he looked at her. "Thank you, my king," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the emotion tightening her throat. "Damien," he corrected gently, loud enough for those nearby to hear, and something in the softness of his tone, the barely concealed warmth in his eyes, told everyone present exactly how much had changed between the Alpha King and the Omega Tracker he had once so carelessly dismissed. The weeks that followed brought changes Elena could never have imagined during those early days of fear and uncertainty. Nolan recovered fully, resuming his position as one of Damien's most trusted guards, his loyalty and gratitude toward Elena evident in the easy friendship that grew steadily between them. Marcus, having proven himself invaluable throughout the investigation, was elevated to oversee reforms within the Royal Hunters, ensuring that skill and dedication, rather than simple rank or bloodline, would determine advancement moving forward. Elena herself found her new position both exhilarating and occasionally overwhelming, the sudden shift from overlooked Omega to trusted royal advisor bringing with it responsibilities she had never anticipated. But she embraced the challenge with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every difficult moment before, and slowly, the kingdom that had once dismissed her began to recognize exactly what Damien had seen in her from the very beginning. Grace visited often, delighted beyond words at her friend's remarkable change in fortune, though she never let Elena forget the early days of their friendship, when Elena was simply a stubborn young tracker with more skill than recognition. "I always knew you were destined for something greater," Grace told her one afternoon, settling beside her in the palace garden that had quickly become one of Elena's favorite quiet retreats. "Though I admit, I never imagined it would involve the Alpha King himself." "Neither did I," Elena admitted, laughing softly at the memory of her first, dismissive meeting with Damien. "If someone had told me a month ago that I would end up here, I would never have believed them." "And now?" Grace asked, watching her friend with knowing eyes. Elena glanced toward the palace, where she knew Damien was likely finishing a long day of council meetings, already looking forward to the quiet evening they would share together once his duties allowed it. "Now," she said softly, warmth filling her chest at the thought of him, "I can't imagine my life any other way." Damien found her there in the garden as the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and amber, and Grace excused herself with a knowing smile, leaving the two of them alone in the gentle evening light. Damien settled beside Elena on the familiar stone bench, taking her hand in his own, with the same easy tenderness that had become so natural between them over the past weeks. "Long day?" Elena asked, leaning gently against his shoulder. "Long but good," Damien said, pressing a soft kiss against her hair. "The trade reforms are finally moving forward properly, the kind my father always wanted, without the corruption Edmund tried to build around them." "He would be proud of you," Elena said softly. "He would be proud of us," Damien corrected gently. "None of this would have happened without you, Elena. You didn't just find Nolan. You found the truth this entire kingdom desperately needed, and you gave me the courage to finally see what truly mattered." Elena lifted her head to meet his eyes, warmth and love filling every part of her heart, as she looked at the wolf who had once ignored her so completely, now looking back at her, as though she were the most important person in his entire world. "I never expected to find any of this," she admitted softly. "Not the truth about Nolan, not justice for your father, and certainly not you." "Life has a way of surprising us," Damien said, a soft smile touching his lips as he leaned closer. "I'm endlessly grateful it surprised me with you." Their lips met in a soft, lingering kiss beneath the fading golden light, sealing a promise that had grown steadily stronger with every passing day since that first fateful night when Elena tracked a rogue no royal hunter could find. The kingdom of Ashwood had been saved from a hidden betrayal. An innocent wolf had been restored to his rightful place, and an overlooked Omega had finally found not only the recognition she deserved, but a love she had never dared to hope for. As the stars began to appear over the palace, Elena rested peacefully in Damien's arms, the Alpha King, who had once ignored her, now holding her as though she were the most precious thing in his entire world, and she knew, with quiet, absolute certainty, that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, side by side, exactly as equals should.